The shuttle touched down on Vreka 4 in the middle of a dust storm, and the first thing Elena Castillo Vargas noticed was the smell. Iron and wet stone and something animal, something ancient and wild that crawled into her lungs and made her heart beat a little faster. She stepped off the ramp with her med kit over one shoulder and her boots already sinking into the red clay, and she looked up at the settlement of Koth's Reach and thought it was the most brutal place she had ever seen. The buildings were carved from volcanic rock, low and heavy, and built to survive the kind of weather that would flatten anything made by human hands. And between them walked the Vren, 7 feet tall, covered in scales that shifted between dark gray and deep green, with jaws that could snap a steel rod in half, and eyes like molten copper that tracked every movement around them. They were predators in the truest sense of the word, born with claws and fangs and reflexes that made even the fastest human look like a statue. And they ruled Vreka 4 the way wolves rule the forest. Not with cruelty, but with the absolute certainty that nothing on this world could challenge them. Elena was 5'3", and she weighed 120 pounds. And she had no claws, no fangs, no venom, and no armor. And when the Vren looked at her, they saw something between a curiosity and a pet. Rikith was the first to greet her, if greeting was the right word, for the way he stood at the edge of the landing pad, with his arms crossed and his copper eyes narrowed, and his lips pulled back just enough to show the tips of his teeth. He was the huntmaster of Koth's Reach, the informal leader of this frontier settlement, and he had been told that the Galactic Accord was sending a replacement medic, and he had expected someone at least large enough to be worth the shuttle fuel. "You are the healer," he said, and it was not a question. "I am," Elena said. She held out her hand, the way humans did, and Rikith stared at it like she had offered him a dead fish. He did not shake it, and Elena did not seem bothered by this at all, and that was the first thing about her that confused the Vren. She did not react the way prey was supposed to react. In those first weeks, Elena did what she was sent to do, which was to serve as the settlement's medical officer, and the Vren tolerated her the way they tolerated the weather. She was a thing that existed, neither useful nor dangerous, and they moved around her without thinking too much about it. But then Elena found the creche. The creche was where the Vren raised their young, not in family units like humans did, but communally, in a sprawling underground den where dozens of pups lived and fought and grew together, under the watch of a rotating guard of adults. And it was the one place in Koth's Reach where no outsider had ever been welcome. Human children in any way that mattered, and Elena understood this from the very first day she walked in, because the very first thing that happened was that a pup the size of a large dog lunged at her and sank its teeth into her forearm. She did not scream, and she did not pull away, and she did not strike the pup, and every single Vren adult in the room froze and stared at her, as blood ran down her wrist and dripped onto the stone floor. She knelt down and looked the pup in its wild copper eyes and said very softly, "I know you are scared, little one, but I am not here to hurt you." The pup released her arm and backed away, not because it understood her words, but because something in her voice, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of fear or anger, triggered an instinct older than language. That was the day Elena began volunteering in the creche, and every Vren in Koth's Reach thought she had lost her mind. The pups were feral by human standards. They bit, they clawed, they snarled, they fought each other for food and warmth and dominance. And they did not understand gentleness, because no one had ever shown it to them, because that was not the Vren way. The Vren way was strength, and the pups learned strength through pain and competition, and the weak ones either grew strong, or they did not grow at all. And this was how it had been for 10,000 years, and no one questioned it. But Elena questioned it every single day. She came to the creche every morning before the dust storm started, and she stayed until the second sun dipped below the ridge. And she brought medicine for the sick ones, and food for the hungry ones, and bandages for the ones who had been bitten too hard in the dominance fights. And she let them scratch her, and bite her, and growl at her, and she never once raised her voice. Within a month, her arms looked like she had been dragged through a thorn forest. And the Vren medics offered to do it herself, treat her wounds, and she refused every time, saying she would rather spend the supplies on the pups. Rikath watched all of this with growing unease, because Elena did not fit into any category he understood. She was not a warrior. She was not a hunter. She was not a mother to these pups. She was not even the same species, and yet she walked into a den of predator young every day, and bled for them, and never asked for anything in return. One evening, he found her sitting outside the creche entrance, cleaning a bite wound on her shoulder, with hands that were steady, even though her face was pale with pain, and he stood over her and said the thing he had been wanting to say for weeks. "Why do you go where even our own weak-blooded refuse to tread?" Elena looked up at him with those strange round human eyes, brown and soft, and completely without the predator fire that the Vren respected, and she said something that Rikath would remember for the rest of his very long life. "Because they are children, and they are hungry, and they are afraid, that is all I need to know." Rikath had no answer for that, and he walked away, and he did not sleep that night. 3 days later, the orbital sensors detected the world scar, a storm system so massive and so violent that it had its own name, a rolling wall of wind and lightning and freezing rain that moved across the surface of Rekka 4 like the fist of an angry god. And it was coming straight for Kath's Reach, and it would arrive in 72 hours. Evacuation orders went out immediately, and the shuttles began warming their engines, and every adult Vren in the settlement knew exactly what that meant. They could save most of the people, but the creche held over 40 pups, and the pups were too young and too many to all be moved in time. And when Elena heard the elders discussing which pups would be left behind, she felt something inside her chest turn to iron. Not going to let that happen. Evacuation began at dawn, and the settlement of Kath's Reach became a place of controlled chaos as shuttles roared overhead, and Vren warriors moved through the streets, carrying supplies and weapons and everything they could not afford to lose. Rikath stood in the command center and watched the numbers scroll across the screen. How many shuttles were available? How many seats remained? How many hours they had before the world scar made orbital insertion impossible? And the numbers did not lie, and the numbers said that 20 of the 43 creche pups would have to be left behind. This was not cruelty in Vren culture, and Rikath needed Elena to understand that, because he could already see the look on her face when she walked into the command center and stood before him with her arms crossed and her jaw set like a wall of stone. "You are selecting which pups to save," she said. "The strongest," Rikath said, and his voice carried no shame, because in 10,000 years of Vren history, the storm had always been the final judge, and the ones who survived were the ones who deserved to survive. And this was the oldest law his people had. "And the sick ones," Elena said, "the runts, the ones with the fever, they stay behind and die." "The storm culls the weak," Rikath said. "It has always been so." Elena stared at him for a long time, and then she said 4 words that changed everything. "Then I stay too." The room went silent in a way that felt like the air itself had been pulled out of it, and every Vren in the command center turned to look at the small human woman who had just volunteered to die with 20 predator pups who were not her species and not her responsibility and not her blood. Rikath moved toward her with the intention of picking her up and carrying her to the nearest shuttle, whether she wanted it or not, because she was clearly out of her mind, and he was not going to let a human die. On his watch, for a decision that was not hers to make. But Elena did not step back, and she did not flinch, and when Rickath reached for her, she looked straight into his copper eyes, and said in a voice that was quiet and absolute, and harder than anything he had ever heard from a creature without fangs, "You will have to break my arms to drag me onto that ship, Rickath. And even then, I will crawl back." He stopped, and his claws were inches from her shoulders, and he could see that she meant it, not as a threat, not as a bluff, but as a simple statement of fact, the way someone might say that the sky was red, or that water was wet. She was going to stay with those pups, and nothing in this galaxy was going to stop her. Rickath pulled his hands back, and stood very still for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He assigned 2 of his youngest hunters to stay behind with her. Their names were Saya and Torek. They were barely past their own rite of passage, strong and fast, and full of the fire that young Vren carried before the world had time to burn it out of them. And they stood before Rickath and received their orders with the stiff pride of warriors being given a mission. But Rickath pulled them aside before they left and told them the truth in a low voice that Elena could not hear. "Your duty is to survive," he said, "not to save pups who are already claimed by the storm. When the walls fail, you run. Do you understand me?" Saya and Torek both nodded, but something about the way Saya's eyes flicked toward Elena made Rickath wonder if she would actually follow that order when the time came. The next 36 hours were the hardest Elena had ever worked in her life. She chose a deep bunker beneath the creche, a storage vault carved into the bedrock that was never meant to house living creatures, but was the only structure strong enough to survive what was coming. And she began turning it into a shelter with nothing but her hands and whatever materials she could scavenge from the abandoned settlement. She sealed the ventilation shafts with emergency foam, and rigged a backup air filtration system from shuttle parts that had been left behind. And she dragged water containers down the stone steps, one at a time, because they were too heavy for her to carry 2 at once. And she organized the medicine into doses, and labeled everything in both human script and Vren symbols, so that Saya and Torek could administer treatment if she could not. She did not sleep for those 36 hours, and when Torek pointed this out, she said she would sleep when the pups were safe. And Torek did not know what to say to that, because no friend he had ever known had spoken about another species young the way this human spoke about theirs. Saya watched Elena work, with a growing feeling that she could not name. It was not respect exactly. Saya had been raised to respect strength and speed and killing power, and Elena had none of those things, but it was something close to respect, something that lived in the same part of her chest, and it confused her deeply. When the pups were moved into the bunker, they came in a wave of snapping teeth and panicked cries. 22 small predators who could smell the storm coming the way their ancestors had smelled it for millennia, and their instincts told them to fight or to run. And since they could not run, they fought everything within reach. Elena took more bites in that single hour than she had taken in her entire time at the creche, and her shirt was torn, and her arms were bleeding in 4 places, and she did not stop moving, did not stop talking to them in that steady, low voice that seemed to reach past their terror and touch something deeper. "I know," she kept saying as she guided them into the bunker one by one. "I know you are scared. I know this is not your den, but I am here and I am not leaving, and you are going to be all right." Torek stood at the entrance, with his claws out and his teeth bared, and watched this tiny human woman herd predator young like she had been born to do it. And for the first time in his life, he felt something that he would later learn to call shame. Shame that he had been ready to abandon these pups. Shame that he had needed a human to show him what staying looked like. The last pup entered the bunker at hour 34, and Elena sealed the door behind them, and the sound of the locks engaging echoed through the stone like the closing of a tomb. 2 hours later, the world scar hit. The noise was beyond anything any of them had ever experienced. Not wind, not thunder, a wall of sound so vast and so violent that it felt like the planet itself was screaming. And the bunker shook, and the lights flickered, and dust rained from the ceiling, and the pups howled in pure animal. Elena sat in the middle of the floor with pups pressed against her on every side, and she held them, and she sang to them, and her voice was so small against the roar of the storm that it should have been meaningless. But it was not meaningless, because the pups nearest to her stopped crying first, and then the ones near them stopped, and then one by one the howling faded until the only sounds in the bunker were the storm outside and the quiet, steady voice of a human woman singing a lullaby she had learned as a child in a country that was very far away. The storm did not pass. By hour 12, Saya checked the sensors and her blood went cold, because the world scar had stalled directly over the settlement, locked in place by atmospheric currents that the weather models had not predicted, and what was supposed to be a 12-hour event was now stretching into something much longer. Elena looked at the water containers, and the medicine, and the food rations, and she did the math in her head, and she said nothing. But Saya saw the way her face changed, and Saya understood what that math meant. By the third day, the bunker had become a world of its own, a small stone box buried under a screaming sky, where time was measured not in hours, but in feedings and medicine doses, and the slow weakening of the lights as the backup generator burned through its fuel. The temperature had dropped to the point where frost was forming on the walls, and the pups were huddled together in a mass of scales and tails, and small sharp bodies, and their copper eyes glowed in the dim light like tiny fires that were slowly going out. Elena moved among them the way she always had, steady, quiet, careful. But Saya could see that something was different now, something in the way she held herself, in the way her hands trembled just slightly when she thought no one was watching. She was rationing herself. Saya figured it out on the second day, when she noticed that Elena always served the pups first, and always turned away when it was her turn to eat, and when Saya confronted her about it, Elena just smiled and said she was not very hungry, and they both knew it was a lie. But Elena said it with such calm certainty that Saya did not know how to argue with it. The water was worse than the food, because the pups needed more of it, their young predator bodies burning through hydration faster than human bodies did. And Elena gave her share to the smallest ones first, the ones with the fever, the ones who were too weak to fight their way to the water containers the way the stronger pups did. Torek kept a count in his head, how many times Elena drank, how many times she ate, how many hours she slept, and the numbers made him feel sick, because the answer to all three was almost never. On the third night, the pups began to break. It started with the two largest, a pair of young males who had always been at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and their instincts were screaming at them that the walls were closing in and the food was running out. Someone needed to fight for what was left, and they launched themselves at Torek with claws out and teeth bared, and the desperation of animals who could smell their own death approaching. Torek caught them, but they opened 4 gashes across his chest before he could pin them down, and blood ran down his scales and pooled on the stone floor. And Saya reached for the emergency restraints and said they needed to cage the aggressive ones before someone got killed. "No," Elena said, and she said it with such immediate and total firmness that both Vren hunters stopped and looked at her. "They are scared," she said. "You do not cage scared children. You hold them." "They will kill you," Saya said. "Then they will kill me," Elena said, "but I am not putting them in cages." She walked to the 2 pups that Torek was pinning to the ground, and she knelt down beside them, and she put her hands on their trembling bodies, and she spoke to them in that low, steady voice. That had become the only constant in this place, and the pups snarled and snapped at her fingers, and she did not pull away, and slowly, so slowly that it was almost invisible. Their muscles relaxed, and their breathing slowed, and their wild copper eyes stopped darting around the room and fixed on her face. She held them until they fell asleep, and then she moved to the next frightened pup, and the next, and the next. Saya sat against the wall and watched this and felt something cracking open inside her chest. A door she did not know she had, leading to a room she had never entered. And she asked the question that had been building inside her since the first day in the bunker. "What are you?" she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "You have no armor, no claws, no venom. You are not strong, you are not fast, you cannot even see in the dark. Why do you not fear them?" Elena was holding a pup that had bitten her arm open just hours before, pressed against her chest, with its eyes closed and its breathing even. And Elena looked at Saya, and her face was so tired and so thin and so pale that she looked like a ghost made of kindness. "Where I come from," Elena said, "we have a word. Madre. It does not mean the one who gives birth. It means the one who stays, the one who stands between the small ones and the dark, even when the dark has teeth." Saya did not speak for a very long time after that. On the fourth day, Elena began cycling the sickest pups against her own body for warmth, pressing them against her chest and wrapping her arms around them, and using the heat of her own failing body to keep their temperatures stable. And she sang to them as she did it, old songs in a language that neither Saya nor Torek understood, songs that rose and fell like breath, like heartbeat, like the rhythm of something so old and so deep that it did not need translation. The pups responded to the singing the way flowers responded to light. They turned toward it, they reached for it, they pressed their small bodies closer to the source of it. And even the ones who were too far away to touch Elena grew calmer when they heard her voice, because it had become the sound of safety in this dark and freezing place. Torek found himself humming along on the fourth night, and stopped immediately, embarrassed. But Elena heard him and smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. And she said, "You have a good voice, Torek. The pups like it." And Torek did not hum again, but he wanted to, and that wanting confused him more than anything else that had happened in this bunker. On the morning of the fifth day, Elena did not stand up. Saya found her sitting against the wall, with 3 pups in her lap, and 2 more pressed against her sides. And her skin was the color of old paper, and her lips were cracked and dry, and her eyes were open, but they had a distance in them that Saya recognized. She had seen it in hunters who had been too long in the cold. "Elena," Saya said, and she knelt down and put her clawed hand on Elena's forehead, and the heat was wrong. Too little of it, far too little, as if the fire inside this small human body was burning down to its last embers. "Listen to me," Elena said, and her voice was thin, but it was still steady, still that same unbreakable calm that had carried them all through 5 days of darkness. "The fever medicine. There are 6 doses left in the blue case. Lucero gets the first one, then the gray pup with the torn ear, then the twins. Do you understand the schedule?" "You need water," Saya said. "The pups need water," Elena said. "Give me the medicine schedule back, so I know you have it." Saya repeated the schedule, and Elena nodded, and then she closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the wall, and the smallest pup in her arms, the runt she had named Lucero, which she had told them meant in their language, light, was breathing softly against her chest. Little Light, in her human language, pressed his face against her chest and listened to her heartbeat. "Stay with me, Lucero," Elena whispered, and it was not clear if she was talking to the pup or to herself. Saya and Torek did everything they could. They wrapped her in thermal blankets. They tried to give her water. They positioned her near the generator for warmth. But Elena's body had been giving itself away for 5 days, pouring its heat and its water and its food into 22 small predators who were not her blood and not her species, and there was simply nothing left to pour. She died sometime in the early hours of the 6th day, quietly, without pain, with Lucero curled against her chest, and 4 other pups pressed against her sides, and she was smiling. When the storm broke 12 hours later, and the rescue shuttle screamed down through the clearing sky, Rickath himself led the team into the bunker, and what he found there dropped him to his soul. Knees. Saya and Torek stood at the entrance like statues, exhausted and hollow-eyed and covered in scratches. And behind them, in the dim light of the dying generator, lay 22 Vren pups, every single one alive, every single one breathing, every single one that the elders had written off as dead. And in the center of them lay Elena Castillo Vargas, small and still and cold, with Lucero pressed to her chest. And the pups would not leave her body, no matter how gently the rescuers tried to move them. Rickath knelt beside her and looked at her face, and saw that she was smiling, and something inside the old huntmaster broke in a way that would never fully heal. The news traveled faster than light itself, carried on communication relays and whispered through diplomatic channels, and passed from ship to ship in the cold spaces between stars. And by the time Elena's body was placed in a stasis pod for transport back to Earth, the entire Vren homeworld already knew what had happened on Vreka 4. A human had died for Vren pups. Not a warrior, not a diplomat, not someone with anything to gain. A small, soft, clawless human woman had walked into a bunker with 22 predator young, and had given them her food and her water and her warmth and her life. And every single one of them had survived, and she had not. The Vren did not know what to do with this information. They were a species that had built their entire civilization on a single principle. Strength was everything. Strength was survival. Strength was the right to exist. And their definition of strength had always been clear and simple and absolute. Claws and fangs and speed and power, and the weak did not, and the weak were culled by the world itself, because that was the natural order of things. Elena Castillo Vargas had none of those things, and she had proven stronger than every single Vren on Vreka 4, and the elders could not reconcile this, and it shook them in a way that nothing had shaken them in 10,000 years. Rickath carried her body to the shuttle himself, and he did not allow anyone else to touch her. And when a young Vren officer reached for the stasis pod, Rickath snarled at him with such ferocity that the officer stumbled backward and nearly fell, and no one tried to touch the pod again. On the shuttle ride to the orbital station, Rickath sat beside her pod, and did not speak, and did not eat, and did not sleep. And Saya sat across from him, and watched the old hutmaster stare at the face of a dead human through the frosted glass, and she understood something that she would carry for the rest of her being. Life, that Rickath was not grieving a colleague or an ally. He was grieving a failure, his own failure, because he had called her fragile, and dismissed her, and tried to drag her onto an evacuation shuttle, and she had been more right, and more brave, and more worthy than he had ever been. The Council of Elders convened on the Vren homeworld within a week, and the session was unlike anything in living memory, because every elder was talking at once, and none of them could agree on what Elena's death meant for their people. Some said she was an anomaly, a single, strange human whose behavior proved nothing about her species. Some said she was insane, that no rational creature would trade its own life for the young of another species. Some said nothing at all, and simply stared at the floor, with the look of people who had just been told that everything they believed about the universe was incomplete. It was Saya who broke the deadlock. Testify before the council, and she stood in the center of that vast stone chamber, surrounded by the most powerful Vren in existence. And she was young, and she was tired, and she still had scars on her arms from the bunker, and she spoke in a voice that did not waver. She told them everything. She told them about Elena's hands shaking as she sealed the bunker door, and about the way she sang lullabies in a human language that the pups could not understand, but that calmed them anyway, and about the way she held a pup that had bitten her arm open and did not pull away. and about the water she gave to the sick ones instead of drinking it herself. She told them about the word madre and what Elena said it meant, not the one who gives birth, but the one who stays, the one who stands between the small ones and the dark, even when the dark has teeth. And then Saya said something that silenced the chamber completely. She was not weak, Saya said. We called her weak because she had no claws and no fangs and no armor, but she was not weak. She was something we do not have a word for, something our language never needed to name because we never believed it could exist. Saya paused and looked around the room at the faces of the elders, and then she offered them the word she had been carrying inside her since the bunker. Vrenkash, she said. The fang that has no fang, the one who fights without weapons, the one whose strength is the refusal to abandon. The chamber was silent for a long time. In the weeks that followed, something unprecedented began happening in the creches across Vren's space. The pups who had survived the bunker, now healthy and growing and strong, refused to enter dominance fights with each other. The creche masters were baffled because dominance fighting was the foundation of Vren childhood development. It was how pups learned their place in the hierarchy. The weak, and these pups, simply would not do it. When the masters pressed them for an explanation, it was Lucero who answered, the runt, the smallest of the survivors, the one Elena had named after a word that meant little light. And he looked up at the creche master with his copper eyes and said with the simple certainty of a child who does not know he is saying something revolutionary, the soft one did not rank us, she held us all the same. The creche master had no response to this, and when the story spread to the other Vren settlements, it hit like a second world scar, because here were Vren children, predator children, born with claws and fangs and the instinct to dominate, choosing to reject the oldest tradition of their species because a human woman had shown them a different way to be strong. Rickath heard all of this from his quarters on the homeworld, where he had been sitting alone for weeks. And on the day he heard what Lucero had said, he stood up and walked to the Forge District and commissioned a blade. It was a traditional Vren honor weapon, a curved single-edged blade made from volcanic glass and meteor steel, the kind of weapon that every great Vren warrior carried as a symbol of their kills and their victories and their place in the hierarchy of the strong. But this blade was different. On one side, Ricketh had the Forge Master engrave a name in Vren script, Elena Castillo Vargas, and on the other side, he had the same name engraved in human Spanish, and when the blade was finished, he sheathed it and hung it at his side, and he never drew it. When the other Vren asked him why he carried a blade he would not use, Ricketh said something that became the second most repeated sentence in Vren history, after Elena's own words about what madre meant. She never drew a weapon in her life, Ricketh said. I will honor that. Word of the blade spread the way Elena's story had spread, fast and far and unstoppable, and it reached beyond the Vren to other predator species in the Galactic Accord. The Kreth heard it first, a race of massive insectoid hunters who communicated through vibrations in the ground, and they sent a delegation to the Vren homeworld to hear the full account. Then the Serok, serpentine predators who had fought the Vren in 3 wars over territory, arrived and sat in the same chamber as their ancient enemies and listened to Saya's testimony in complete silence. Then the Voidborn, deep space hunters who lived in the dark between stars and who had never set foot on a planet in their entire history as a species, sent a message asking for the story to be transmitted to their fleet, and the message contained a single word that no Vren linguist had ever seen in the Voidborn language before. The word translated roughly as humbled. Every predator species in the Accord was asking the same question, and it was a question that had no easy answer and no comfortable resolution, and it echoed through council chambers and war rooms and creches across 100 worlds. How was the weakest creature in the galaxy the bravest one among us? 20 years had passed since the World Scar, and the galaxy was not the same place it had been when Elena Castillo Vargas walked into a bunker on Vrecka 4 and did not walk out. Lucero stood at the entrance of a creche on the Vren colony world of Reshka 7, and he was no longer the runt that Elena had cradled against her chest in those final hours. He was 7 feet tall and broad-shouldered and covered in dark green scales that caught the light like polished stone, and his copper eyes held a warmth that other Vren found unusual, but that the pups under his care found irresistible. He was the first Vren in recorded history to become a certified xenobiological field medic. The other warriors had laughed when he announced his intention to train in human medicine, and some of the elders had called it a waste of a strong body. And his combat instructors had told him he was throwing away a career that could have made him one of the greatest hunters of his generation. Lucero had listened to all of them, and then he had enrolled in the program anyway, because he remembered something that he could not explain to any of them. He remembered the sound of a heartbeat beneath his ear when he was small and sick and terrified, and he remembered a voice singing words he did not understand in a language that was not his own, and he remembered the feeling of being held by someone who was dying and choosing to spend her last warmth on him. That memory was the foundation of everything he had become. He worked in creches now, traveling from world to world across Vren space, and he treated the sick pups and fed the hungry ones and bandaged the ones who had been bitten too hard. And when the pups were frightened, he did not cage them, and he did not leave them. He knelt down and he held them and he sang to them, and the songs he sang were the same ones Elena had sung in that bunker, because Saya had recorded them and taught them to him, note by note, when he was old enough to learn. He did not know all the words, because they were in Spanish, but he knew the melodies by heart, and the pups responded to them the way they had responded to Elena, not because they understood the language, but because the songs carried something in them that was older than language, something that said, "You are safe, and you are not alone," and "I am here, and I am not leaving." The tradition of the blade had grown beyond anything Rickath could have imagined when he commissioned that first weapon 20 years ago. It had started with the Vren, a handful of warriors who heard the story and went to their own forge masters and asked for blades engraved with Elena's name. And then it had spread to the Kreth, who did not use blades, but who began carrying polished stones etched with her name in vibrational script, and then to the Sirach, who wove her name into the ceremonial bands they wore around their throats, and then to the Voidborn, who carved it into the hulls of their ships in letters so large they could be read from orbit. Every predator species in the Galactic Accord had adopted its own version of the tradition, and while the forms were different, the meaning was always the same. The blade, or the stone, or the band, or the carving, was carried but never used in anger, because it did not represent the power to kill. It represented the power to choose not to kill, the power to protect instead of dominate, the power to stay instead of flee, the power to hold a frightened child against your chest, even when your own body was failing. It was the strength of the one who has no fangs. The Galactic Accord's cultural observers had been tracking the effects for 2 decades, and the data was staggering. Predator species that adopted the blade of Elena showed a 40% reduction in interspecies violent incidents, a near-total elimination of creche abandonment practices, and a measurable increase in cooperative behavior during joint military operations. Entire generations of predator young were being raised differently now, not because anyone had passed a law or issued a decree, but because the story of a small human woman who died in a bunker had wormed its way into the deepest foundations of their cultures and had changed the way they understood what strength meant. There were universities that studied it, philosophers who debated it, warriors who lived by it, and children who grew up hearing it as a bedtime story. the tale of the soft one who had no claws and no fangs and no armor, and who walked into the dark and held the small ones until the dark took her and could not take them. The memorial on Vreka 4 was simple, because Elena had been simple. Not simple in the way that meant less, but simple in the way that meant clear and true and without pretension. It stood at the site of the bunker, a single stone marker, waist-high, carved from the same volcanic rock that the settlement had been built from, and on it was engraved her name and a single line that had been translated into 200 languages by 200 species across the known galaxy. The line read, "She stayed." That was all it said, and that was all it needed to say, because those 2 words contained everything: the choice to remain when she could have left, the choice to give when she had nothing, the choice to love what was not hers and protect what could not protect itself, and stand between the small ones and the dark, even when the dark was going to win. Rikath came to the memorial on a morning when the red dust of Vreka 4 was still, and the twin suns were low on the horizon, and he moved slowly, because he was old now, ancient by Vren standards. His scales faded to silver gray, his copper eyes dimmed but still sharp, his body bent by time but not yet broken by it. Lucero walked beside him, and neither of them spoke. They approached the stone, because there was nothing to say that the stone did not already say. Rikath knelt, slowly, painfully, with the care of a body that had earned every ache it carried, and he reached to his side and unclipped the blade he had worn for 20 years, the first blade, the original, and he placed it at the base of the stone with hands that were steady despite their age. He stayed on his knees for a long time, and Lucero stood beside him and did not rush him, and the wind moved across the red plain and carried dust that settled on the blade like a benediction. When Rikath finally spoke, his voice was rough and low and full of something that Vren voices were not supposed to carry, but he did not try to hide it. "We are predators," he said. "We were born to hunt and to kill and to conquer. We thought that was strength. Then a small, soft, clawless human woman walked into our creche and held our dying young against her chest and sang them lullabies as the world tried to kill her." He paused, and his claws tightened on the edge of the stone. "She did not survive. Every single pup did. We have carried blades for 10,000 years, and we never understood what they were for until she showed us. They are not for drawing, they are for remembering." He looked up at Lucero, and the old huntmaster's eyes were bright with something that the Vren had no word for, but that humans called tears. "Her name is on every blade because she is the sharpest edge we have ever known, and she never cut anyone." Lucero placed his hand on Rikath's shoulder and held it there, and the old warrior leaned into the touch, the way a pup might lean into the warmth of someone who was not leaving. And for a moment, they were not a huntmaster and a medic. They were just 2 people standing before a stone that held the name of someone who had changed everything. 10,000 light-years away, on a world that Elena had never visited and would never know existed, a young Kreth warrior stood in a ceremonial hall and received her blade for the first time. A curved weapon of bone and crystal, beautiful and deadly, with a name engraved on one side in Kreth vibrational script, and the same name on the other side in human letters, Elena Castillo Vargas. The young Kreth held the blade up to the light and ran one claw along the engraving, feeling the letters beneath her touch, and she sheathed the weapon and clipped it to her side, and she walked out of the hall and across the compound to the creche where the youngest Kreth larvae were kept. The larvae were frightened. They were always frightened in their first weeks, small and soft, and overwhelmed by a world that was too big and too loud and too bright, and the creche workers were doing their best. But the larvae flinched at every sound and curled into tight balls at every shadow. The young warrior stopped in the doorway and looked at them, and she thought about a human woman she had never met, on a world she had never seen, who had knelt down in front of frightened predator young, and opened her arms, and said, "I am here, and I am not leaving." She did not bare her teeth. She knelt. She opened her arms. And far away, on a red planet, where the wind carried dust across a simple stone marker, the name carved there caught the light of the twin suns, and held it, the way she had held everything, gently, fiercely, and without ever letting go.